David French, welcome back.
Oh, thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
I was going to say welcome back to the Holy Post, but this is officially now French Friday.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, it was
Ukulele
fun.
and everything.
Guess what day it is? Oh, it's French Friday. It's French Friday. So grab your fries and say hooray. David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
You've been busy writing as always, and there's two pieces that you've written in October that one October 5th was called Personal Harassment is Spiraling Out of Control. And then more recently, October 25th, you wrote J.D. Vance and the Great Challenge of Christian Malice. So I saw these as somewhat related, and I thought it would be a good point for us to start at. Let's begin with the J.D. Vance piece. For those who aren't aware of J.D. Vance, he's the author of Hillbilly Elegy, which then it was a best-selling book, then became a movie.
Right.
You've interviewed him. You had positive things to say, I think, about the movie as well.
Yeah, I liked the movie.
He's now a Senate candidate from Ohio.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit, just to get everybody up to speed on the same page, the transition of J.D. Vance from his Hillbilly Elegy fame to Senate candidate. What has changed in his public persona?
I think in the world of professional wrestling, you'd say he's taken a heel turn. Think of Hulk Hogan coming on to and I'm only remembering this Hulk Hogan move from a newsletter I read earlier today. I think it was 1996, coming into WCW ring. Everyone thought he was going to be Hulk Hogan, the good guy, and he ends up pounding the good guys and joining the bad guys. But it's a long digression to say something has changed with J.D. Vance. When he originally wrote Hillbilly Elegy, which I read and found to be a pretty moving book, an insightful book, he was highlighting a couple of things. One was sort of a lot of the way that he grew up in. He didn't really truly grow up in Appalachia, but he grew up in an Appalachian family, and some of the pathologies that he saw, and some of the things that he saw that a lot of people who haven't grown up, say, in the rural South, are not all that familiar with. And he was really sort of seen as this guy who got rural working class America in a way that could communicate with people in the Acela corridor. And the book became a real sensation. And during this whole time when this book is becoming a sensation, he's very much distressed by the Donald Trump phenomenon. He sees Trump essentially as a con man, a charlatan, shares a lot of what I think are our views about Trump. And that's when I got to know JD a little bit. And then over time, he very publicly converted to Catholicism. This made some national news when he did. And then over time, he began to become much more of a sort of an outspoken, I guess you would almost say like Tuckerite, nationalist, conservative, very Trumpist in his outlook. And now he's running for Senate as a Republican in Ohio. And he and a fellow named Josh Mandel basically almost engage in a game of one-upsmanship on who can sort of write the most inflammatory tweet, or who can say something that triggers the libs, so to speak, most effectively. And after Alec Baldwin tragically shot and killed a cinematographer, Vance had a very trolly tweet, basically, where he was saying that he wanted Jack Dorsey to let Trump back on Twitter just so he could read what Trump would say about Alec Baldwin accidentally killing somebody. And I just connected that with some other things that I have seen in this sort of nationalist conservative right that's heavily Christian influence, Catholic, yes, but Protestant also, to where quite explicitly this is a movement that has begun to reject norms of civility, reject decency as basically optional for the sake of the larger cause. And so that's why I wrote about, and I sort of used the evolution of J.D. Vance as a frame for it.
Yeah, he sort of represents in microcosm where a lot of the conservative movement has gone over recent years. And one would argue a lot of the white evangelical church as well has seemed to have followed the same pattern. Okay, one of the things you do in the piece, and you've done this frequently in numerous pieces over the last couple of years, is you lament the decline of decency as what's now considered a secondary value. We value it, but it's not of utmost importance is kind of it's worth sacrificing. Those who disagree with you try to justify it by saying, well, we're at war. We are at war, and if you keep decency as a primary value, we're going to lose the war because our opponents are not keeping decency as a primary value. So that raises two possible questions for me, and you can pick which one of these you want to answer. One is, make the case that we're not at war, and therefore decency shouldn't be sacrificed. Or if you think we are at war, make the case that decency is so important, it's worth possibly losing that war over in order to keep decency in place.
I think both are really simple arguments to make, quite frankly. Look, there is no question that we have intense disagreements in American culture. And there's no question that there are people who are intensely cruel, who oppose us, or who, whether you're on the left or the right, you can point to intensely cruel people manifesting intense disagreement. But it's not a war. It's not a war. And I got to sort of tell a story on myself, something that I'm not very proud of at all. So I used to be a much more partisan Republican person, and I wrote about this in my book, but I'll never forget, right before I deployed to Iraq in 2007, I was part of the surge, and I was with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. Right before I deployed is at a conservative conference in California, and I was giving a stem winder of a speech about the left's attack on civil liberties and religious freedom and yada, yada, yada. And at the end of it, somebody asked me a question about, well, if you're doing all of this great constitutional work here at home, why are you going off and deploying to Iraq? And I had this very crowd-pleasing kind of answer that makes me cringe today. And it was something along the lines of, I believe there are two great threats to the United States of America, and it is jihadists abroad and radical leftists at home, and I feel called to fight them both. Crowd cheers, all of this. Then I deployed to Iraq, and I'm not going to say I was a JAG officer. I deployed with a line unit. I deployed with a combat arms unit. I was outside the wire a lot. I was not doing all of the things that everybody, that the armor and cav troopers, the armor officers and cav troopers I deployed with were doing. But I saw the war. And I felt really embarrassed about what I said. I felt really embarrassed because, look, I might have disagreed a ton with my neighbors in Cambridge, Massachusetts when I was in law school, or a ton with my neighbors in Ithaca, New York, which I think at the time was the only city in America with a socialist mayor when I was teaching at Cornell Law School, or disagreed with my neighbors when I was working in a law firm in Manhattan. But I had a good life in all of those places. I mean, my son was born in Ithaca. I was a part of a wonderful Christian fellowship in Cambridge. I was part of a wonderful church in Manhattan. I had a good life. I had disagreements, but I had a good life. Try having a good life in Balad Ruz, Iraq, circa 2007. Where there was an actual in an actual war where there were actual enemies. And so ever since then, I when I got home, I started to kind of zig away from this really negative partisanship at the same time that a lot of people were zagging towards it. And so I just began to feel like I was increasingly out of step with the times, sort of year by year, day by day. So the idea that this is war, come on, it is not war.
Did you have a sense even back then that the rhetoric of war that was so commonly used on all sides would lead to eventual possible actual physical violence in America? Or is that something that's become more recently a factor in your mind?
It's much more recently. So I knew that the rhetoric was out of control. What I didn't know is that the morality and the conduct would eventually start to match the rhetoric. And because, we have a long history in this country of pretty ridiculously extreme political rhetoric. Mm-hmm. Going back to the founding, you can always point to, can you believe what this founder said about another founder? But, you can kind of skip over that and also realize that a lot of times the out of control rhetoric created dangerous real world situations. I mean, even going back to the founders, there was a sitting vice president who shot a former secretary of the Treasury in a duel. They made a musical out of it. And so what I guess I underestimated was the extent to which and how quickly actions would start to match rhetoric. I mean, let me put it this way. I wrote a book that postulated that if we don't change the direction we're heading, the country could split apart. And even I was taken by surprise by January 6th. In December, I was sort of like pounding the drum and trying to get anyone who would listen to understand that violence might happen real soon. And this was, in the fall of 2020 and moving in December of 2020. But even the takeover of the Capitol, I didn't expect that. So I would be lying. I would be lying if I said that my alarm about our rising polarization was appropriately proportional to how quickly it got bad and how severe it got. So I didn't see it coming as quickly as it came.
Okay, speaking of polarization, there's a University of Virginia poll that has found 52% of Trump voters and 41% of Biden voters support splitting the nation.
Right.
I mean, that's just stunning to me that the numbers are that high. And my dog, Steve, is hitting the stopper on my door in the office.
I love it.
That's great. It's like his doorbell. It means he wants the door to open so he can get out. He's going to have to wait for a minute. I don't suppose that statistic means these people are in favor of a civil war, because it is technically possible to split the country without a civil war. Right. But it does speak to the fact that a huge chunk of this country thinks we are beyond reconciliation.
Yeah. And this is something that a lot of people are beginning to wake up to at once. I mean, this is something that I have been thinking about for a while. And like you, I don't think people want a civil war. I think in a weird way, what you have is a degree of animosity that's becoming so great that a lot of people would be happy to say goodbye to each other. It's the analogy I've used is much more sort of a national divorce.
Right.
And when I was on my book came out in a pandemic, and I was on this sort of Zoom book tour, that's not all it's cracked up to be. It's always better to like meet people in real life. But I was shocked. The most common question I got wasn't, what can we do to stop this? It was, why should we stay together? And that was kind of jolting to me. And the polling result, because the polling result doesn't say, or the poll doesn't ask, should we go to war with each other? It's essentially, should we split apart or allow someone else to leave? And the answer to that does not surprise me at all. That's how much we have grown disgusted by each other and sick of each other, willing to believe the worst about each other. And that's exactly the circumstances where you see in real life people divorce, they break up business partnerships, or you name it.
So answer the question that you were asked. Make the case for why we should stay together? Why should this marriage persevere despite the animosity that exists?
Well, that's a great question. And the answer is really pretty simple. And that is, for all of the flaws of the United States of America, and we know the flaws of the country. We know that when the first slaves arrived on the shores of the United States in 1619, that was sort of symbolic of something quite significant, that the New World, the so-called New World, which of course wasn't new to the actual inhabitants of the New World, but the so-called New World was going to be very much like the old. There was going to be a lot of abuse, exploitation, oppression, enslavement. But then when the words of the Declaration of Independence were written, and in a way, even more importantly, when the Bill of Rights was ratified, what happened with the United States was that there was a statement and an articulation of principles that were good, that were in direct opposition to sort of that spirit of 1619 that says that this new world was going to be like the old. And the way I've looked at the history of the United States is this constant struggle between the reality of that sort of spirit of 1619 versus the aspiration of the spirit of 1776, this notion that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And that those aspirations are good aspirations. And one of the ways that we know they're good aspirations is that basically every marginalized community in the United States, to obtain the rights to which they were entitled, has appealed to those aspirations, King talks about the promissory, cashing in on the promissory note of American liberty and freedom. Frederick Douglass, one of the most powerful things he wrote and what speeches he delivered was this plea for free speech in Boston that was an appeal to these constitutional liberties that were being systematically denied, not just in Boston at the time, but certainly in the American South. And so the idea that we're going to abandon a nation whose aspirational principles are built on very real virtues in a fit of anger and fury at each other and expect that whatever comes out of that anger and fury is going to somehow be better than what we've abandoned, I think is historically foolish and presumptuous.
Okay, but you're assuming that a separation means a dissolution of the Constitution itself and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence. Could it not be a case where, I don't know, 2/3 of the United States continues, but 1/3 secedes and establishes its own identity?
Well, that would be, if you're talking about a 1/3 that secedes and establishes its own identity that is quote unquote liberated from the liberties established in the Declaration and the Bill of Rights, then you're talking about not with the same severity because there isn't slavery, but you're talking about in many ways recreating the dynamic of 1861.
Yes,
which is,
absolutely.
And to me, that's a dramatic loss would be a dramatic loss for the people of the country and also for the people of the world to have that level of fracture. And then the other thing that I'd say is, and I wrote about this in the book, is because I imagined some scenarios for how the country could split. Things would unwind in ways that could be very unpredictable and quite catastrophic.
Mm-hmm.
And so sort of this idea that I know we could manage appropriately and peacefully and without secondary effects that would not be unacceptable, the dissolution of the most powerful nation in the history of the world and the recreation of one or two or three additional nations. Man, we're just living in a world of short-sighted, unrighteous rage, and we're risking something. We're risking something that is built on good principles, even though it has failed to live up to them in many times. Built on good principles, and that has an effect on our lives and the lives of the citizens of the world in ways that we don't really truly fully grasp or comprehend.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with you. I'm not trying to advocate for this. I'm just trying to advocate for the devil's side of things. It seems to me that the federal government is so intertwined in our whole national existence, from the military to the regulation of the economy. I mean, through so many different facets that to disentangle that would be a nightmare. And any attempt to disentangle that would be crazy. Not to mention just the population. I mean, 100% of the people who live in Texas are not red state Republicans.
True.
Just as 100% of the people who live in New York are not blue liberal Democrats, right? So if you suddenly split up this country, you may have a mass migration in your hands that would be just catastrophic. So I think it's unrealistic, which actually makes me more fearful of violence and warfare. Because if we can't separate and we have to figure out how to live together and the animosities keep strengthening and the rhetoric keeps escalating, what do we do with that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, everything you say is exactly correct. I would also note that some of those same dynamics were in play in 1861. Not all of Virginians favored secession. Not everybody in Illinois or Indiana wanted union. So there was a lot of division even within states all the way back then. But the other thing that haunts me about this, as I see this rising anger and animosity, is history is replete with examples of small things triggering giant catastrophes through the foolishness and incompetence and hatred of men. I mean, perhaps the paradigmatic example of that in the last, 120 years is moving from the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand to World War I. At the time, the Great War, the war so catastrophic it was considered at the time the war to end all wars. And small, foolish, silly, ridiculous things can create catastrophic consequences when they happen in the context of an enormous amount of rage and distrust.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that terrifies me as a student of history, is the realization that massive events in world history often hinge on the malignancy of a single personality.
Right.
And that can have so much impact and power, which is a little bit what's frightening about what's happened in our country in recent years when you think about who has come into power. Okay, let me shift a little bit away from sort of the national animosities and the abandonment of decency and talk about how this has come into the church.
Right.
How do you explain the fact that anger and malice has come to be embraced as a virtue among so many Christians today?
Whew. I mean, I think that's a multifaceted answer. I mean, part of it is the anger and malice are quite seductive to our fallen human natures. And so, in virtually every context, whether you're struggling in a marriage, whether you're struggling in your business or your career or in relationships or friendships, we're all really drawn towards anger, malice, self-righteousness as a not a last resort, but a first resort when we feel under siege. But I think in politics, there is a problem that even magnifies it a little bit more than that sort of natural human nature that we have. And that is that we have spent a lifetime telling the church what they should do in politics, not how they should do it. In other words, your object, your end is pro-life, to protect unborn life or to defend religious liberty. That's why Christians are in politics, or for these policy outcomes. Okay. You do not have seminars, classes, instruction in the same way you do about how to be a Christian businessman. How to be a godly husband and a father, or a godly student, where a lot of it is not about the what. I mean, when you hear about how should you be a Christian businessman, it is not a how to make $1 million. It's
It
mainly
depends who
about,
you're listening to.
well, true. I mean, yeah, there is some prosperity teaching out there, but the sound teaching is not focused on how how much money you're going to make. It's focused on how do you live, treat your employees, how do you treat your customers, how do you treat your bosses. Same with being a Christian student. It is not how to make all A's. It is how do you live on this campus. And then
Okay,
with politics, it's very different.
hold on, David, because I mean, I agree with you, but I have to push back.
Okay.
There's definitely an emphasis on ethics, not merely outcomes in good Christian teaching. My experience in the evangelical subculture has been, yes, there was an emphasis on ethics, but it was often married to those ethics will get you the outcome you want also.
That is
Right?
true.
Like sexual ethics, as a teenager being told things, if you keep yourself within these boundaries, the marriage you've always wanted is going to be fulfilling and wonderful, and you'll get that carrot at the end, right? That prize. If
Smoking hot wife theology.
Yeah, that
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
The sexual prosperity gospel, as Caitlin
Yeah.
Beatty has called it.
Yeah.
In business, hey, you treat your customers right, you treat your employees right, you're an ethical, moral business leader, you will be successful financially.
Right.
And I think some people have had that attitude politically as well, which is, well, if Christians do the right things, then we will get the policy wins that we want. But that hasn't really been the case. And so I think some people are saying, well, if I'm not going to get it by being a nice guy, I'll get it by being a jerk. And therefore, the end justifies the means.
I think you're exactly right. And it actually gets to the second question you asked earlier, which we didn't answer, which was, why are you decent? Even if it's not war, or even if you might lose, why are you still decent anyway?
Right.
And so I think healthy teaching talks about ethics not as a means to an end, but sort of the ethics, the way in which you interact with people and how you love them is an end in itself.
Right.
That is the object of your engagement. It is not kindness for a purpose. It is kindness. And so that's where, I've had a lot of problems with the I kiss dating goodbye approach, for example, going back to the 1990s. And that was sort of a lot of sexual prosperity gospel. Here's the godly way to live, and the justification for this sort of ethic of self-sacrifice of your sexual desires or inclinations is then they will be richly, you'll be richly rewarded for your temporary delayed gratification. But all of that was just an elaborate way of saying, we're going to, here, the ends are the most important thing. And here I figured out a way to sort of have a godly means to the ultimate end, but the ultimate end was always the ultimate end. And I think a healthy approach to politics is not one that says that the ultimate end is the ultimate end, that the policy change is ultimately, at the end of the day, the thing that matters. And we don't have to look anywhere farther than Jesus Christ himself. I mean, he came to earth in a imperial backwater under the thumb of an imperial oppressor, and was executed at the end of his earthly ministry by that imperial oppressor. If there was ever a time to sort of say that the earthly ends of Christian engagement are really what it's all about, the earthly political transformational ends of Christian engagement are ultimately what it's all about, what better time than to just waltz into the world and overthrow an empire, right? Which was entirely within his ability, entirely.
And what his own disciples expected.
I mean, that's why people missed the Messiah, is they had it fixed in their mind who that Messiah would be and how he would interact with the world. And so that's why when I talk about this, I try to connect politics not to what you rightly and fairly say is, okay, like sexual prosperity gospel, or a kind of a backwards kind of material prosperity gospel where if you act right, you'll be rewarded on this earth. But obedience is its own end.
Yeah. I think we underestimate how rare that value really is, even within the evangelical culture. And here's what comes to my mind. Years ago, I was in an arena with 15,000 other pastors at a very large ministry conference. And there was a speaker on the platform who was a very well-known Christian pastor. The name would be known to everybody listening to this. And he gave a talk about leadership using the story of Nehemiah from the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And I forget the exact text, but there was a text in there about how Nehemiah lived with humility and acted in a very humble way, despite being the leader of this group of people who are rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And the leader speaking went on and on and on about moral leadership and how, because of Nehemiah's humility, he had moral leadership and moral capacity to tell other people what to do. And then he went into this whole talk about the importance of moral leadership and ethics and on and on and on. But it was always, you need to lead in a moral way because people will follow you then, as the people followed Nehemiah. Right. And what drove me out of my mind as I'm sitting there with 15,000 other pastors listening to this is the verse itself said that Nehemiah lived this way because he feared the Lord. He wasn't doing it as some tactic. It wasn't just a smart leadership principle to get people to follow him. He did it because he feared the Lord. That's why he lived the way he lived, not because it was useful, not because it was practical, not because it was a great outcome. And yet that was ignored throughout this whole talk. And even there, in a group of thousands of church leaders, the message was pragmatism. At the end of the day, it's pragmatism. It's outcome that measures something's success. And so I think we underestimate how much that value has permeated evangelicalism, even in its highest levels, and why something like Trumpism and, what Sohab Amari and others are advocating for in their, distancing of decency in order to win battles. I can see why it's widely received and receptive to an evangelical audience.
Well, what you say is really interesting because it connects very deeply with a story we tell about ourselves as an evangelical church. And that story that we tell about ourselves is that you had an evangelical church and you had a mainline church. And the mainline church abandoned God, abandoned the scripture, and diminished. The evangelical church remained faithful and grew.
Right.
Okay. So this growth, this sense of measurable, tangible earthly success, as a sort of natural outgrowth of obedience, is sort of deeply ingrained in kind of the modern evangelical church's origin story, which is we did the right thing and we were rewarded for it in very tangible ways. But I think what we're learning, and this is something that goes back to the Jesus and John Wayne book, which there are aspects of it that I disagree with, but I think directionally it's hitting on something really important. And that directional thing is maybe we weren't growing because we were so faithful. Maybe we were growing in a lot of ways because we'd found a particular secular market niche, and a particular secular market niche that could marry religion and marry faith to a quite secular cultural series of developments that began in the Cold War, or brought to fruition in the Cold War, in the latter parts of the Cold War, and then sort of continued forward in a post-Cold War era. And I think that was this, to me, that was the central insight, was not necessarily that if you're going to look at evangelical history, that, oh, look at all of these people who absolutely got it right when the main line got it wrong. And therefore we were rewarded with the numbers. And to be honest, that's a story I've kind of told myself a little bit over the years. Maybe there was something else going on, that you had an evangelical church that at a large scale connected with the community and in a secular sense better maybe than many of the mainline churches connected in that secular sense, and built communities through secular means. And then when push came to shove, and you really had this moment in 2016 and following, where was the secular side going to prevail, or was the spiritual side going to trump? A giant pile of people resoundingly not only went down the secular side, they scorned the idea that you would choose any other path.
Right. Yeah. Your mentioning of the myth of evangelical success is interesting, because that narrative that the evangelical church remained faithful to the gospel and the scriptures and therefore grew has now reached a point of cognitive dissonance, because as the numbers decline, they have to somehow reconcile that, right? The Southern Baptist Convention has been declining. Numerous other denominations are declining. Churches are declining. And there has to be an explanation. And I wonder if we're seeing the emergence of a sort of evangelical lost cause theology now, where the message used to be, we were faithful, that's why we grew. Now the message is becoming, we're faithful, that's why we're shrinking. Now we're the persecuted minority. And that's the way people are trying to reconcile the cognitive dissonance between the numbers that have emerged in recent years.
Or it's something like this, that we're shrinking because the church is not faithful anymore. It's getting woke. And this is, I think it's a multifaceted thing, right? I think it's multifaceted. So there's but here's one of them, I think, is, if a church is shrinking, if a church is losing its members, if you are deeply ingrained in the notion that faithfulness means an increase in numbers, then you're going to be saying, well, we're not faithful. Why are we not faithful? We must be getting too woke. We must be. And this is one of the things that I think is lending a lot of the emotional urgency to the woke and anti-woke battles right now, to the point where, Sky, if you think about it, the 2019 Southern Baptist Convention resolution on intersectionality is now considered woke. That's how extreme a lot of this is getting. And I think a lot of that emotion and a lot of that energy is around this notion that, well, wait a minute, if we're losing numbers, if the story is when we're faithful, we grow, and we're losing numbers, that must mean somebody is poking holes in sort of the ship of fidelity. And where are we leaking? And the wokeness argument comes up, and so many different arguments come up when we're just flawed in the initial assessment, which says that losing members is proof of inadequacy of is somehow proof of inadequacy of the church.
Yeah, it's I've written about this many times over the years, but it drives me up the wall because if you were to take the measures we use for our own ministries and apply them to Jesus' ministry, we'd have to conclude he was a total failure.
Fired. You'd have to fire him.
Yeah, I mean, John
Mhm.
6, a great example. The crowds are following him, and then he starts teaching some he won't do more miracles. He refuses to do more miracles. And then he starts teaching some crazy stuff about drinking his blood and eating his flesh. And it says everyone left.
Yeah.
Except, and it's clear when you read that passage carefully that he was quite intentionally thinning the herd.
Yeah.
He was determining, are you really here because you want me or because you just want the show?
Right.
You know, you want all the miracles. And he even turns to the 12 and says, aren't you going to leave also? And as Peter often does, he says something ridiculous, which in that story is we'd like to leave, but we left everything back in Galilee when we came here to follow you. In other words, we have nowhere to go. And then he turns around and says something brilliant, which is, besides, you have the words of life. So,
Mhm.
you know, he gets it and doesn't get it at the same time, which is sort of
Right.
Peter's role in the Gospels. But that determination, that willingness to lose followers in order to remain faithful or to expose what their hearts truly desire, is something that's very rare in a lot of evangelicalism. We don't want to lose anybody for any reason, even a good one.
Right. And if you do lose anybody, then people will dunk on you incessantly.
Right.
Well, you're not relevant anymore. Where's your constituency? Where's your following? And it really demonstrates how much we have connected sort of all of these measures of, metrics of, say, business success, or metrics of whether a band is flourishing or going the way of Spinal Tap, to go back to the old mockumentary. And so we've really imported these sort of metrics of success, and say, this decides it. This decides it. And it's so counter scriptural. I mean, it's so counter scriptural, but it so powerfully connects with the story that we've told about ourselves for 40 years,
Yeah.
And it's the story I grew up with. I mean, I was born in 69, raised in the South, and this is the story hammered in, hammered in, hammered in. Those people departed. We stayed faithful, and look at us now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a hard thing. That's a hard connection to sever in your mind, as when you're reading scriptures, and you realize, wait a minute, Jesus ended his earthly ministry, or phase one of the pre-resurrection earthly ministry, with like 5 people
Yeah.
at the foot of the cross, or however many, while soldiers are casting lots for his garments. What? I mean, it's that kind of thing that disconnects with, look at our church growth metrics.
Right. Speaking of growth metrics and malice, let's talk about Facebook.
Yes.
In recent weeks, a lot has come out through what's now being called the Facebook papers. There was an engineer at Facebook named Francis Haugen who leaked, a whistleblower leak, thousands and thousands of pages of documents dating back to 2017, showing that within Facebook, there was a lot of awareness that their platform and algorithm was doing a great deal of damage, not just in the United States, but globally. And they are very ineffective at monitoring or removing hate speech or other inflammatory things. And there's a lot of internal rhetoric within Facebook about their contribution to the January 6th insurrection of the
Right.
Capitol. One quote from this is from an article in The Atlantic. The Facebook papers show staffers sounding alarms about the dangers posed by the platform, how Facebook amplifies extremism and misinformation, how it incites violence, how it encourages radicalization and political polarization. Again and again, staffers reckon with the ways in which Facebook's decisions stoke these harms, and they plead with leadership to do more. How do you think, what liability, or maybe liability is the wrong word, culpability does Facebook have for where we are politically and culturally right now? All the stuff we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes.
Yeah. So let's just talk about beyond Facebook, social media at large.
Right. Facebook just being the largest example of it.
Facebook is the largest example, hardly the only one. I mean, I think social media has secondary culpability and we have primary. Like we, the people who are using it. Like Facebook doesn't make me be a jerk. All right. There is nothing that Facebook does that makes me write anything horrible. And there's this really funny anecdote at the start of the Wall Street Journal story about Facebook that to me is just perfect. And it begins like this. It's fall of 2018. The CEO of BuzzFeed emailed an official at Facebook, and he was complaining. And he said that there's a post that BuzzFeed wrote titled 21 Things That Almost White People Are Guilty of Saying that received a bunch of shares and comments. But other things that BuzzFeed wrote about animal videos and self-care had more trouble breaking through. And he was mad at Facebook. Okay. To me, this is almost perfect because what I see time and time and time again is people who take very little responsibility for the way in which they engage with the world. Furious that other people are not regulating the way in which human beings interact with the world. And I think the fundamental issue that we have with social media is the users of social media. It's us, it's people. And I think that there are things that Facebook has done that are bad. One of the things I like the least about what Facebook has done is that one of the stories is that they had sort of two sets of rules. If you achieved a certain level of fame, you're going to be shielded from sort of that normal enforcement mechanism. I think that's bad. I think creating the two sets of rules enabled a lot of bad behavior and enabled a lot of people to achieve a degree of notoriety through bad behavior. So I am not in any way saying Facebook has got this right in all respects. No. Or Twitter. No. But the problem that we have is fundamentally is that what we have now is the ability to communicate to more people, for more people to communicate to more people than we've ever had in the entire history of the human race. And what we're seeing is human nature sort of put on blast.
Yes.
And it is rough. It is hard. And to say that this corporation or that corporation can fine tune their algorithms. Another thing that was really interesting about it in 2018, Facebook tried that. In 2018, Facebook tried to fine tune its algorithm to really surface a lot of stuff that was better stuff. And they couldn't do it. It actually caused the reverse. And so a lot of this gets really, really, really hard. And so, yeah, I think it's a much more complicated story than we tend to say. I think a lot of it is if you're going to platform 1 billion people, watch out.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I know you're obviously a very strong advocate for the First Amendment and the 2nd Amendment. And there's a similar argument going on here. It's sort of the guns don't kill people, people kill people thing, where, Facebook's not to blame or social media itself is not to blame. It's the heart of the people behind it that are using it, which is to blame. And amen. Yes, we all agree. We probably share an anthropology that says we are fallen, sinful people. And the darkness of our hearts is evident in all things. But now, because of technology, there's the ability for the darkness of human hearts in aggregate to do an enormous amount of damage that didn't exist before this technology. It's a little bit like saying, from a Christian worldview, we would argue we need government in order to restrain evil. And the real problem is that people are evil, absolutely. But a government that fails in its responsibility to restrain that evil is also contributing itself to the evil. And it feels to me a little bit like Facebook is not doing its social responsibility or just its moral responsibility to restrain the capacity of evil that people are capable of doing through their platform.
I would say I agree. I would say both Facebook, I would say with Twitter, I would say with TikTok. I don't know if you saw the story that TikTok, there was now a lot of young girls are manifesting tics, sort of that there's a social contagion sort of towards Tourette style tics that they've traced to TikTok. I would say, yes, each one of these corporations as they touch their user base, has even if they've tried to do the right thing, they've often failed, and sometimes their efforts have had the opposite effects of what they intended. And B, sometimes don't even really try, because quite frankly, if they really tried, that might hurt the stock price or hurt their growth, and so they don't really try. Totally, absolutely, will stipulate to that. But I also know that a lot of these companies, there's a lot that they do to try to stay ahead of the sort of the curve of human depravity. And so Facebook, for example, they ban pornography. Well, people are constantly trying to circumvent that on Facebook.
Sure.
It's like a cat and mouse. It's similarly, Instagram bans pornography. It's a cat and mouse. A lot of these platforms, the regulation of hate speech, for example, my gosh, if there's anything history teaches us, that's easier said than done. I remember talking to a senior tech executive 2 or 3 years ago, and they were talking about their hate speech policy. And I said, for 20, 30 years, major universities tried to regulate hate speech. Some of the smartest minds in American higher education tried to create utopian free speech environments with hate speech codes. And what they found time and time again is the hate speech codes themselves began to be wielded as weapons in various culture wars. And I totally get the imperative of trying to create family-friendly spaces. You should try to create family-friendly spaces. But the more you try to fine-tune human interaction, the more you try to sort of create a free speech environment that is all the good stuff about free speech and none of the bad stuff about free speech, the harder and harder and harder that gets. And I think that is one of the difficulties of the debate, is because I'm always debating people who are for greater regulation of speech, especially through the government.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the hard things about debating folks who are of that mind is they can always sort of paint an alternative vision where they tell the crowd, I can create a series of rules and regulations that provide you all of the benefits of free expression, and none of the negatives, but much fewer of the negatives. And it's a quite compelling vision, and that'd be a great world to live in. The problem is, all the king's horses and all the king's men have been trying to do that for a long, long, long time, and it's just, I think it's a long way of saying that we are blaming social media. We are over blaming social media for the maladies of our country. I believe. Look, I could be totally wrong about that, but we human beings are quite capable of ripping each other to shreds without Facebook or Twitter. I mean, I'm rough on my history, but I think in 1861, Twitter was in its infancy, and we were quite capable of awful things.
Yeah, I'm not arguing that social media has fundamentally worsened human depravity. It hasn't. We are as depraved as we have ever been. It's a matter of the distance our depravity can travel and how quickly it can aggregate like-minded depraved people into a movement.
Yes.
So, and I wonder if part of the dilemma here for these social media companies is volume. And what I mean by that is there a moral responsibility for these platforms and those managing them to say, yes, it is near impossible to regulate healthy speech for billions of people. Therefore, we are not going to grow the volume of our platform more quickly than our ability to oversee it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair critique.
In other words, if I run a newspaper or a magazine or a website or a television program, I can't suddenly invite thousands of people to all express themselves on that platform if I don't have enough editors to edit their writing. But we've essentially said to social media companies, you have no responsibility. I mean, and they're trying to do that with things like you mentioned, pornography and hate speech. They're more successful at keeping porn off of their sites than they are hate speech. But it's clear that they have put volume and profitability far ahead of maintaining quality or ensuring that the content on their platforms is socially acceptable, or at least not causing harm. So that's where I feel like we have just so lost sight. It's just like given now that billions of people have to be on these websites. It's just a given that they
Yeah.
have to make unseemly amounts of money every month. It's just a given that those things, those are untouchable. And somehow they have to work with 6 billion people and figure out how to regulate their speech. Yeah, I agree. That's an overwhelming idea that is ridiculous to consider. But we shouldn't have allowed it to get to that point in the first place.
I guess I think of it. So I kind of approach social media as it's offering a technological disruption and paradigm that is in some ways comparable to things such as the invention of the printing press or the invention of radio, followed by television. You're talking about extraordinarily disruptive technologies that once invented cannot be uninvented. And you can connect the printing press and the development of the printing press to pretty massive disruptions of the world order.
Yes.
You can absolutely connect, heck, the development of the assembly line and an industrialization to massive disruptions in the world order. Same with radio and television. And I feel like what you're dealing with is a disruptive technology in social media. And so that raises a lot of it. And I think that we're moving towards another one. Man, we're way afield of our initial plan, but we're moving towards another one, which is VR, virtual reality. I think we're beginning to move into a world where people could live online in a way that is so much more rich and fulfilling than anything in their physical world that we might. And that technology is just, you can almost reach out and touch it. It's so close. And so I look at it as one of these extremely disruptive technologies that has been and can be used for great good and great evil. And I guess what my main thought in the debate over it is I try to just kind of tap my foot on the brakes that says that there's this obviously correct path that Facebook or Twitter or any of them could have taken and should have taken, and especially that the government should force them to take, that would have given us the benefits of the social media technology without the detriments of the social media technology. And at the end of the day, I've just never heard a compelling alternative proposal other than, for example, I think some modest stuff that could make a difference. Like if you have $500 million in quarterly profit, can 50 million of that, 100 million of that go into, better and more creative ways of regulating and stopping the ways in which your platform is used for trafficking? But I would be, or the ways in which your platform, people are trying to circumvent porn restrictions in your platform. But I'm really careful about sort of the misinformation, hate speech kind of formulation, because frankly, we're often not great at even understanding misinformation in real time. We have a problem with that.
Yeah, I agree. But I think we could talk about this for another hour. Those technologies you mentioned, the printing press, radio, television, all very disruptive, amazing technologies that changed the world and changed the direction of civilization in many ways. The difference with social media, I don't think it's just, this is the next progression in that technological advancement. I think this is different in kind, in that all those other technologies kept in place a basic function of civilization for the elite. In other words, there were gatekeepers with access to television. There were gatekeepers with access to the radio. There were gatekeepers who had access to the printing press. There were some prohibitive barriers to accessing those technologies that made them, to publish a book. The average Joe couldn't just publish a book. The average person couldn't get on television and speak to 350 million Americans. Anybody can get on social media and with enough personality attract a following and say whatever they want about almost anything. And that is a radical leveling of structures that have for 10,000 years kept civilization in some sort of order. And so I think we're monkeying with something we don't really know. We can't just say, well, it took us a couple decades to figure out the printing press, or a couple decades to figure out radio, and it was disruptive, but we figured it out, and we'll
We
do
never
that with
figured any of it out.
Right.
I would say we
this
never figured any of it.
And this is on a level that I think we're in completely uncharted territory, and what the effect might be. And I do think that there's not just darkness in the individual human heart, but there are, to get a little theological, I'd argue there are spirits of communities, there are spirits of civilizations. And I think we are dabbling with one in this dynamic of social media that takes individual evil and grows it exponentially in a way that you can't just account for it with individual bad actors. I don't think January 6th happens without social media and many other recent things. Okay, and we only have a few minutes left. I don't want to take up too much.
I mean, I don't know. We've had uprisings. We've had, we have not had January 6th, but we've had Boston Tea Parties. We've had Bleeding Kansas. We've had, holy smokes, we've had a lot of popular uprisings. And the one thing I would say about the printing press is, if you talked about the elite at the time, you talk about disrupting the elite control. Right. My goodness. And not just books, but pamphleting and leafleting. So yeah, I mean, and to say we figured none of it out, because we human beings never figure anything out.
Okay. To your point though, like those other uprisings, I'm sure I'm overlooking something. I think what makes January 6th different, and I wrote a piece about this shortly after it happened, is like even September 11th, as horrible and evil as that attack was, the terrorists did it for reasons that were rooted in fact. Oh, now my dog's going crazy again. Like they did it because the United States had troops in Saudi Arabia. That was true. It didn't justify the attack, but it was true. The South revolted against the North and seceded because they thought the election of Abraham Lincoln would be a threat to their perceived right to own slaves. That was true. It didn't necessarily justify succession or the Civil War, but their perception was correct. What's interesting about January 6th is those people stormed the Capitol for something that was a provable lie. There was no stealing of the election, but social media created this separate environment in which they found it utterly believable. So the speed with which lies can accelerate in the world because of social media, and people can exist in an alternative reality of lies, is frightening in a way that has never existed before in history.
Yeah, I agree with you on speed, but the power of the lie, man, I can point to a couple of wars in American history. Spanish-American War, yes. Remember the Maine.
Sure.
Heck, if you look at the secession documents in 1861, in Texas's secession document actually contains a conspiracy theory around poisoning of water supplies. There was, if McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, which is just probably the best single volume history of the Civil War, talks about how the metastasizing conspiracy theories surrounding sort of the North's embrace of John Brown after the Harper's Ferry raid,
right,
created this quote unquote unreasoning fury in the South. Because one of the questions has always been, so why? There was certainly these emerging there were these divisions between North and South around slavery. Why 1861? Like, why 1861? Why not 1850? Why not 1864? What was it? And part of it was this growth, this metastasizing. You had the partisan press. You had this sort of belief that the North wanted to commit genocide against the South to free the slaves. I mean, so yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you on, for example, the speed of lies, and I'm with you that there are ways in which social media has really, as I said, it puts human nature on blast. In a way that other technologies have not been able to. But At the same time, I'm extremely skeptical of sort of this notion that if Facebook had a different algorithm, American history would be different in some
Yeah.
important way. And that seems to be a lot of what you'll see on Capitol Hill or in critics of big tech, that they just put so much on the Facebook algorithm or the Twitter shadow ban, and they put too little on that we're just watching humanity be humanity.
Yeah. I mean, you and I have debated gun rights a little bit, and
Right.
it seems like there's some people who are saying we're going from, a shotgun to a handgun with 5 or 6 bullets in it,
Right.
and it feels more like to me we're going from a shotgun to giving everybody a bazooka or some kind of, shell armament that could destroy whole buildings. Like the magnitude of damage that can be done now with social media. I affirm free speech, but like even you, somebody who's a very strong gun rights advocate and Second Amendment advocate, you yourself have limits on what armaments you think average
Sure.
citizens should have access to. So there's one thing to defend yourself. It's another thing to have, the kind of weaponry that the United States military has access to. And I feel like with social media, we're not just talking about should someone have free speech or not, but the ability to magnify that speech in a level that can do enormous damage. And that's what's under debate here. It's not,
Mm-hmm.
is free speech good or bad? Is the human heart good or bad? We'd all agree on those things. It's, do these platforms pose a risk to social welfare and even peace in our country and around the world to a degree that something needs to change other than just
Yeah.
people need to be nicer.
Well, right. I do. I mean, can any given social media company do a better job? Yes, absolutely. Can any given social media company or a collection of social media companies do such a better job that they're going to fundamentally alter and restore something about our culture, fundamentally repair something about our culture that is broken? I don't think so at all. Like I just don't think so at all. I think that it's interesting if you look at a lot of the polarization data about American polarization, it really began rocketing upwards well before Facebook was a thought in Mark Zuckerberg's head.
Right.
Um, it was a lot of some of these really pronounced trends that began to polarize us, for example, began well before anyone had invented social media, thought of social media, or the smartphone was in existence. And now, did it accelerate some of it? Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Totally. But what we're dealing with right now is we're in the grips of a lot of seismic sort of tidal forces that we're looking for the thing that is going to be, if we tweak this, if we tweak this, if we tweak this. That's not to say that the tweak isn't better or worse. That's not to say that at all. But I think that what I'm saying is that people have overly high hopes for the tweaks.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. It doesn't mean we shouldn't make them. So,
Or, yeah, well, I know, but I think we should also be humble in thinking that we know what they are. I mean, that's it's interesting to me that in 2018, Facebook thought it was. Do you remember when they rolled out we're tired of all of the political debates. Let's go back to sharing like what I had for dinner last night and, my pictures with Aunt Betty. This was a big rollout in 2018 and it just blew up. Like people figured it out. They gamed
yeah.
it.
Well, and that's going back to your human nature argument. We are wired to be attracted to things that make us angry and
mhm.
outraged. And so when you're not going to change human nature, but when you create a platform that has a monetary incentive to keep people outraged and angry, eventually they're going to find a way to do that, right? And
Yeah.
so, I mean, what's
Oh,
come out
sure.
from these leaks is that Mark Zuckerberg and other leaders, perhaps other social media companies as well, basically said, yeah, we're all for a nicer, more wholesome form of engagement as long as it doesn't affect our bottom line. So, that's what I mean by social responsibility.
Mhm.
And whether it's the tobacco companies or the gun companies or the social media companies, at some level, we need leaders that take responsibility for what they create and not just saying, well, it's the users who are always the problem. Well, when your creation exacerbates the worst aspects of those users, there's a problem there that we need to look at. So I might argue that the tweaking would have more of an impact than you would, but I'm certainly not content with the status quo and just going, oh, well, we'll just figure out how to live with it.
I am not content with the status quo on any front, but I'm much more of the mind that we often don't know. So let me back up a little bit. I would argue that to this day, that talk radio and cable news are actually more malignant on the right side of the spectrum than social media. And that actually has had a much more and continues to have a more significant effect on people's hearts than Facebook.
But don't you think some of those right-wing radio and cable news outlets are affected by social media? Is it a chicken and egg kind of situation where their audience is expecting a higher and more aggressive form of engagement because social media has conditioned them for that?
I think social media has maybe fragmented them a little more. It used to be you had some like sort of a Mount Rushmore of titans. You would have Hannity and you would have Rush and you would have Levin and those people are all still big. I think there's been a lot more fragmentation in the market, in part through social media, but the ethos of the market, what it is the market is about, has very much been more dictated by that 30-year unwinding consequence of the construction of an alt universe, an alt media universe on the right that didn't tack towards responsibility and didn't tack towards high quality reporting and analysis,
right?
But tacked towards outrage. And social media connects with that, no question, and it makes a very natural connection with it. But to this day, I think that we're much more influenced by the right-wing cable news and talk radio context than we are by the Facebook algorithm, at least on the right. I'm on the left. I think you have some different things in play.
Wow. Time will tell. We'll see what happens. David, you've been really generous with your time. Thank you for doing this again. I know our audience, they've been clamoring for another French Friday, and we covered a ton today. So thank you. We didn't even have time to talk about Dune and the announcement that there will be a part 2.
Well, Sky, I'm just looking forward to the day when French Friday is occurring completely in a virtual reality space. And I am dressed as Paul Atreides and conducting the interview as Paul Atreides, and then we're wondering about why in the real world all of us have shriveled up into barely functioning adults, but in the Avatar world we're strapping, strong, and mighty.
Nice thought, nice vision. I assume you've read the book.
That's our future.
I assume you've read the book and you're a fan, and that's why the movies are appealing.
I've probably read Dune 5 or 6 times.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, if you identify a nerd thing, Sky, I've been immersed in it.
Okay, we need to do a French Friday, maybe for the holidays. That's just a nerd French Friday where we talk Lord of the Rings and Dune and Star Wars, and we have to do that. I think we put that on the agenda.
I'd be all about it.
Okay, David, thank you so much.
Thanks, Guy. This was fun.
French Friday is a production of The Holy Post, featuring David French and me, Sky Jitani. Production by Carla Haskins. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This podcast is made possible by the support of Holy Post listeners like you. To find out how you can become a supporter of The Holy Post and to engage more common good Christian content, visit holypost.com.